In every person on this earth, there is the power and will to work and fight for greatness, whether it be in athletics, academics, or in any field. Friedrich Schiller Faust, also known as Max Brandt to those who followed many of his Western stories, chose to become one of the best novelists and short story writers of his generation. He was known all over America for much more than just Western stories, however, as he dabbled with much more than just short story writing. In this video, we'll take a look at his life timeline, his patriotism, and his personal life. Friedrich Schiller Faust, also known as George Owen Baxter, Evan Evans, George Evans, David Manning, John Frederick, Peter Moreland, George Chalice, and Frederick Frost. I know, how many names can a guy have? Well, he was an American author born in Seattle, Washington. He unfortunately grew up without his two parents, as they both passed when he was just a small child. He grew up in Central California and worked as a cowhand on a few ranches in the San Joaquin Valley. He eventually worked hard enough to put himself into the University of California, Berkeley, where he attended until he was a senior, but then dropped out. After college, he decided he was going to join the Canadian Army, but only after a year he left and moved to New York City to pursue a career. He wanted to pursue a career in writing, as he wrote while in college. He wrote for his school newspaper, student publications, and different poetry magazines. What's quite odd is that whenever he wrote poetry and had it printed, he went by his own name, Frederick Faust, instead of his many pen names. I wonder why. Well, anyway, he began to sell stories to Frank Munsey, who worked for pulp magazines. He made his money this way until he tried to enlist for World War I, where he was rejected. So then he decided he would write extensively for pulp magazines. He worked through the 1920s, writing story after story after story, where he would have multiple stories in one single issue. A lot of his stories stem from his love of mythology. Many were adapted into films for their popular success. One of his most popular characters, Dr. Kildare, was adapted to film, comic books, and other forms of entertainment. In 1938, he made the move to Hollywood and decided to become a screenwriter. He wrote for different studios, two of which were MGM and Warner Brothers. He would be paid around $3,000 a week by Warner's, which at the time was an average worker's salary. He was a very wealthy and famous man. He was a very popular figure and writer until his death in 1944, which was very abrupt as he was killed in combat. This was just a short timeline of his life. Now I want to get really in depth and talk about his patriotism and his support for the war effort. Throughout his entire career, Faust constantly supported war efforts and was a very patriotic man. He wanted to help the United States in whatever way he could. So once World War II began, because he couldn't enlist in World War I, he decided he was going to enlist, even at his age, and fight for America's freedom. He was very well liked, and a lot of the men always talked about how happy they were that such a popular author was along with them. However, while he was in combat, he was mortally injured when a piece of shrapnel hit him. After he died, he was then commended for his bravery by the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Friedrich Schiller Faust was a very popular man in this time period. He was also a family man. He had a wife who he married in 1917 and never divorced. Her name was Dorothy Schillig. With her, he had 3 children, and they lived happily until his death. Faust was known as one of the greatest writers during his time period, and is rivaled as one of the best authors of all time. He has quite the legacy, with nearly 30 million words written on paper. He has so many stories printed, it's hard to count. He was a family man, soldier, but also was truly one of the best short story writers to have ever lived. So thank you for listening and watching, and I hope you truly understand now the man that Friedrich Schiller Faust really was.